Midnight was the hardest hour on B Block. The noise of the day was gone, and there was nothing left between a man and his own thoughts. I spent 12 years learning what that hour does to you. So when I first really read the story I want to tell you tonight, one line stopped me cold. Two men, beaten bloody, locked in the worst cell in the building, their feet clamped in wood, and at midnight, of all hours, they are singing. I had to know what kind of men do that and why. Let me not talk about myself much. Let me take you into Acts chapter 16, slowly, because almost everything people think they know about this story sits on top of details they have never actually looked at. Start with the city, because it matters. Paul and his companion Silas were in Philippi. Philippi was not just any town, it was a Roman colony, which was a proud thing to be. It meant the place was a little piece of Rome planted far from Rome, full of retired soldiers and citizens who took Roman law and Roman dignity very seriously. Hold on to that, because it becomes the hinge of the whole ending. And before the trouble, notice how the church in that city actually began, because it frames everything. The first convert in Philippi was a woman named Lydia. She was a dealer in purple cloth, which was a luxury trade, expensive goods for wealthy buyers. She was a businesswoman with her own household, likely well off. Paul met her at a riverside where some women had gathered to pray, and the text says the Lord opened her heart to pay attention, and she and her whole household were baptized, and she opened her home to the missionaries. So keep the bookends in mind as this story unfolds. The gospel in Philippi begins with a successful merchant woman by a river, and before the chapter is over, it will reach all the way down to a slave girl nobody valued and a jailer at the bottom of the civil service. Top of the society and bottom of it in one short chapter. That is not an accident. Luke is showing you the reach of the thing on purpose. Now the trouble. There was a slave girl in that city who had what the text calls a spirit of divination. People believed she could tell fortunes, and her owners, plural, made a lot of money off her. She was a business. She followed Paul and Silas around for days, shouting that these men were servants of the Most High God, who proclaimed the way of salvation, which was true, by the way. What she was shouting was accurate. But Paul, the text says, became greatly annoyed and finally turned and commanded the spirit to come out of her, and it did. And here is the detail people skip. The moment that girl was freed, her owners did not care about her at all. They cared that their income was gone. The text is blunt about it. When they saw that their hope of profit was gone, they seized Paul and Silas. The whole storm that follows is not about theology. It is about money. They dressed it up as a religious and civic complaint, but the engine underneath was a lost paycheck. That is worth remembering every time you see outrage in public. Follow the money before you believe the reason people give you, and do not rush past what actually happened to that girl, because it is easy to. She was a slave, owned, and on top of that, she was being used to generate income off something in her that tormented her. She was doubly in chains. A person owned by men and a mind owned by something else. When Paul freed her, he got nothing for it. It cost him, in fact, everything that came next. Her owners lost a revenue stream, so they made sure Paul paid. There is a hard truth folded into that. Sometimes doing the right thing for a person nobody cares about is exactly what brings the beating down on you, because you have touched somebody's money. The first casualty of freeing that girl was the freedom of the men who freed her. They walked straight from that good deed into the stocks. The beating itself deserves a word, because the text is specific and we tend to blur it. They were beaten with rods. That was a formal Roman punishment carried out by officers called lictors, who carried bundles of wooden rods for exactly this purpose. It was public, it was brutal, and it was meant to humiliate as much as to hurt. This was not a scuffle. It was the machinery of a Roman colony coming down on two men's bare backs in front of a crowd, blow after blow, with full official approval and no trial underneath it. By the time they were thrown inside, they were men who had been broken open in public by the state. So they dragged the two men into the marketplace before the magistrates. and they frame it cleverly for that proud Roman colony. They say these men are Jews, and they are throwing our city into an uproar, advocating customs that are not lawful for us Romans to accept. They knew exactly which buttons to push in that town. A crowd forms and joins the attack, and the magistrates, without anything resembling a trial, order the two men stripped and beaten with rods. Not a symbolic swat. The text says they were beaten with many blows, their backs laid open, and then, bleeding, they are thrown into prison, and the jailer is ordered to guard them securely. Now watch how the jailer reads that order, because it tells you what kind of place this was. Told to keep them secure, he does not just lock the outer door, he puts them into the inner prison, the inner cell. Think of the deepest, darkest room in the building. No window, no light, the place reserved for the ones you least want getting out. And even that is not enough for him. He fastens their feet in the stocks. Stocks were not just restraint, they were a device that forced the legs apart into a fixed, painful position and held them there for hours, so that a man could not shift, could not ease the ache, could not sleep. So picture it exactly. Two men whose backs are torn open from a public beating, shoved into the blackest cell in a Roman jail, legs clamped apart in wood, in the dark, with no trial, no sentence, and no reason to expect anything but more of the same in the morning. And it is right there, the text says, that around midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the other prisoners were listening to them. I want you to feel how strange that is, because I have been in buildings full of locked men at midnight, and I know what usually fills that hour. It is not songs. So sit with the picture. These two are not singing because things are going well. They are singing from the bottom of the worst night of the trip, in pain, in the dark, in chains. And notice the last part. The prisoners were listening. That inner cell was not soundproof. Every other locked up man in that place was lying there in his own darkness, hearing two beaten strangers sing. Whatever freedom those two had, it was loud enough to travel down a cell block at midnight, and every prisoner in the building could hear that it was real. And think about what singing even is in that moment, because it is not nothing and it is not automatic. A groan is involuntary. Pain pulls a groan out of you, but a song is a choice. You have to decide to shape your breath into words and a tune, and you cannot do it by accident. So these two men, in the worst physical state of the trip, chose to aim what breath they had upward instead of just letting it leak out as suffering. They were not singing to escape the pain. You cannot sing your way out of a torn back. They were singing because their attention was fixed on something the pain could not reach, and the singing was the evidence of where their eyes were. That is the difference between a man merely enduring a night and a man who is free inside it. One survives the dark, the other one has something to say to it. Then the earthquake. Suddenly, the text says, there was a great earthquake, so violent that the foundations of the prison were shaken. And all at once, every door flew open and everyone's chains came loose. Read that carefully, because it is easy to speed past. Not just Paul and Silas, every door, every prisoner's chains, the whole jail came open at once. This was the moment. In any prison movie you have ever seen, this is when the men run. The doors are open, the chains are off, the guards are down, and the road is clear. And they do not run. Nobody runs. That may be the most shocking sentence in the whole account, more shocking than the earthquake. The men stayed in a prison with the doors hanging open, which tells you something enormous about what had already happened in that cell before the ground ever shook. The freedom Paul and Silas had was not waiting on the door. They were already free at midnight, singing with their feet in the wood. The earthquake did not give them their freedom. They had that before it arrived. The earthquake only opened a door they turned out not to need in the way you would expect. And their staying was not passive. It was a decision made in the dark with freedom physically in reach. Running would have been the natural thing, the human thing, and it would also have cost the jailer his life and slammed the door on everything that was about to happen to him. By staying, Paul chose a locked cell and a guard's soul over his own open road. That is what the deeper freedom does. when it is real. It stops being about your own exit. A man ruled only by the need to get out would have been gone through that open door before the dust settled. These men had something steadier than the need to get out, and it kept them sitting in an open prison long enough to save the man who ran it. Now the jailer. He wakes up, sees the prison doors standing open, and draws the only conclusion a Roman jailer could draw. The prisoners have escaped, and under Roman law, a guard who lost his prisoners would pay for it with his own life. He knew what was coming for him, and in that despair he drew his sword to end things himself rather than face it. And Paul, from inside the dark cell he could have walked out of, shouts with a loud voice, "Do yourself no harm, we are all here." Stop and picture that too. The prisoner is the one saving the guard's life. The man who was beaten on that man's watch, locked in that man's deepest cell, is the one who calls out to keep him alive. The jailer calls for lights and rushes in and falls down trembling in front of the two men he had chained a few hours earlier. And he asks the question the whole story has been driving toward. "Sirs," he says, "what must I do to be saved?" And their answer is simple: believe in the Lord Jesus and you will be saved, you and your household. And then look what this hardened jailer does. He takes these two bleeding men that same hour of the night and he washes their wounds. The man who put them in stocks is now cleaning the blood off their backs. And that same hour, in the middle of the night, he and his whole household are baptized. Then he brings them into his own house, sets food in front of them, and the text says he rejoiced along with his entire household that he had come to believe. Look at the order of what he did, because it preaches on its own. First, he washed their wounds, and then he was baptized. He tended to the men he had hurt before he saw to his own soul. The care for the people he had harmed came first, almost by instinct, the second the change was real in him. That is what a genuine turning looks like from the outside. It does not run first to get its own comfort. It turns first toward the ones it wronged. A few hours earlier, this man drove wooden clamps onto their legs. Now he cannot do enough for them. Nobody talked him into it. The change simply produced it. In one night, the roles completely turned over. The keeper became the servant. The prisoners became the hosts, and the one who had been free to go home every night turned out to be the man who was actually in chains the whole time until that midnight. The morning brings the last piece, and it goes back to that proud Roman city. The magistrates send word to just let the men go quietly, release them, move them along, no fuss. But Paul refuses to leave quietly, and here is why. He says, "They have beaten us publicly, uncondemned, men who are Roman citizens, and thrown us into prison, and now they want to push us out privately. No, let them come themselves and escort us out." Paul had been a Roman citizen the entire time. Under Roman law, beating a citizen without a trial was a serious crime, and those magistrates had done it in front of a crowd. When the officials heard the word citizen, the text says they were afraid. The men who held all the power the day before now come personally and ask the two beaten prisoners to please leave the city. The whole structure of who had authority over whom had quietly flipped. So let me pull the meaning up out of the details, because the whole story is built around one idea, and it is the idea in the title: freedom behind bars. The Bible is drawing a hard line between two kinds of freedom, and it wants you to see that they are not the same thing. There is the freedom of an open door, the physical kind, the kind that lets your body walk out. And there is another kind that a man can have with his feet clamped in wood in the darkest cell in the building. Paul and Silas had the second kind before the earthquake ever touched the first. The song at midnight was not them pretending the chains were not real. Their backs were bleeding. The chains were completely real. It was them showing that the chains were not the deepest fact about them. Something in them was already loose that no stock and no inner cell could reach. I learned the hard way inside that these two freedoms can come apart in both directions. I watched men walk out the front gate after years, physically free, get on the bus with their papers in hand, and carry the prison out with them, still ruled by the same fear, the same anger, the same need to control everything, still locked in a cell you could not see. And I watched men with no release date, men who would die inside, who were freer in themselves than half the people walking around out there, because something had settled in them that the sentence could not touch. Physical freedom and this deeper freedom are related, but they are not the same thing, and one does not guarantee the other. A man can be released and still be a prisoner. A man can be a prisoner and already be free. Acts 16 is not being poetic when it draws that line. It is being precise. The open door and the loose chain are one kind of thing. The song at midnight is another, and it is the one the whole story is really about. And I have to be careful and honest right here because this is where a man like me could twist the story to flatter himself, and I will not do it. Paul and Silas were innocent. They were beaten for something that was not a crime, thrown into that cell by corruption and a mob. I was not innocent. When I went into my cell, I had earned it. So I cannot stand next to Paul in that story and pretend we are the same. The man singing in Philippi was wrongly imprisoned, and I was rightly imprisoned, and honesty about that difference matters more than a nice sermon. But here is what does carry across, and it is the thing that took me years to understand. The freedom Paul had in that cell was never about being innocent. It was about who he belonged to and where his hope was anchored. And that kind of freedom is not reserved for the innocent. It was offered in that very story to a guilty man too. Because do not forget the jailer. He was not a wronged saint. He was a working part of the machine that beat two innocent men and locked them in the dark, and he did his job that night without a second thought, stocks and all. He was, in the moral sense, on the wrong side of that cell door, and he is the one who ends the night washing wounds and rejoicing in his own home. The same freedom that let Paul sing reached all the way over to the man who had chained him. If the story only freed the innocent, the jailer would be a footnote. Instead, he is the point. The Bible put a guilty man and innocent men in the same building on the same night and offered the same freedom to all of them. Years later, Paul wrote a letter back to that exact city, to the believers in Philippi, and he wrote a good part of it from another imprisonment. And in that letter from custody, he keeps using one word, rejoice. Rejoice in the Lord always, he writes. And again, I will say rejoice. He says he has learned to be content in any circumstance, whether he has plenty or is in need, whether he is full or hungry. He is not writing that from a comfortable house. He is writing it as a prisoner to a church that was born the night he sang in their city's jail. The man practiced in that inner cell what he preached in that letter. He had found the secret of a freedom that his circumstances could not hand him and could not take away. And notice he calls it something he learned. He says he has learned to be content, that he has learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. Learned. That word is doing a lot of work. It means it did not arrive in one flash on one dramatic night. It means he practiced it, failed at it, came back to it over years and over more than one prison cell until the contentment was actually his and not just a nice idea. The freedom he sang about in that Philippi jail was not a mood that struck him. It was the fruit of a long apprenticeship in trusting God when the circumstances gave him no reason to. That is honest, and it is a lot more useful to a real prisoner than a magic feeling would be. It says the thing can be learned slowly by an ordinary man in the worst conditions. So let me bring it home to the men and women who might be watching this from inside a cell or from inside a life that feels like one. This story is not only for the innocent, it would be a smaller and colder story if it were. The song at midnight is not a reward for being wrongly accused. It is a freedom that comes from somewhere deeper than the verdict on your paper, and the proof of that is the jailer, a guilty man, brought into the same joy before sunrise. I am not going to tell you faith will open your door. It did not open Paul's, not really, and he did not need it to. I am not going to tell you the past goes quiet, or that your victims are erased, or that the sentence you earned disappears because you started to sing. None of that is in this story. What is in this story is a freedom that the deepest cell in the building could not keep out, offered to beaten men and to the man who beat them on the same night, in the same dark. Criminals are not outside the walls of that offer. The jailer was the first one through it. Next time I want to sit inside that later letter, the one Paul wrote back to Philippi from another chain, and what he meant by learning to be content, because that word learning tells you it did not come easy or fast. But for tonight, hold the picture. Two men at the bottom of a Roman jail, feet in the wood, backs torn open, singing loud enough that every locked man in the place could hear it. The doors opened, and they stayed, because the freedom they came for was never on the other side of the door. It was already there, in the dark, at midnight, in a song.